September 24th, 1942. Vinnytsia, Ukraine. Führer Headquarters, Werewolf. The door to the conference room closes with deliberate softness. General Oberst Franz Halder stands rigid, his Chief of Staff uniform pressed to perfection. Every decoration precisely aligned. 58 years old, ramrod straight from decades of Bavarian military tradition, he looks like what he is, the last of the old guard. Behind him, through windows reinforced against Soviet air raids, Ukrainian forests stretch toward a horizon that now feels impossibly distant from Berlin. Adolf Hitler sits at the head of the table. He does not gesture for Halder to sit. The previous 48 hours have dissolved into a series of confrontations that began with intelligence reports and ended with shouting. Halder's hands, normally steady during the most chaotic battle briefings, betray the slightest tremor, not from fear, from something worse. The realization that the war is about to be lost because the man across from him refuses to see it. Herr Generaloberst. Hitler's voice lacks its usual theatrical edge. Flat. Final. You no longer possess the aggressive mentality required for modern warfare. Halder served in the trenches of the Great War. He planned the invasions of Poland, France, the Balkans. He directed Operation Barbarossa. 3 million men crashing into the Soviet Union with such force that Moscow nearly fell. For 4 years, every major German military operation passed through his hands, was refined by his mind, was executed under his authority. Now, in 6 words, it ends. He predicted this moment, wrote about it in his diary, a document he's kept in meticulous shorthand since 1939, recording every meeting, every decision, every warning ignored. Volume 7 sits incomplete in his quarters, ending with yesterday's date. There will be no Volume 8. The disagreement that brought them here wasn't about tactics or training. It was about numbers. Simple, undeniable arithmetic. 2 weeks ago, Halder received intelligence from Army Group B's sector. Soviet forces were massing northwest of Stalingrad and south along the Don River. Not raids, not probing attacks. Armies. 700,000 men, 1,400 tanks. The Romanians and Italians protecting the German flanks weren't equipped to stop them. The 3rd Romanian Army, stretched across 100 miles of steppe, had antiquated equipment and inadequate anti-tank weapons. The Hungarian 2nd Army held twice that distance with units that lacked heavy artillery entirely. Halder ran the calculations. If the Soviets attacked those flanks simultaneously, and every intelligence report suggested they would, the 6th Army fighting in Stalingrad would be encircled, cut off, destroyed. He brought this assessment to Hitler 3 days ago. The Führer's response began with mockery, escalated to rage, and ended with Hitler physically threatening him, fists raised, screaming that the Soviets were already dead, that Stalin could possibly not field another 1 million men, that Halder's mathematics were the mathematics of a defeatist who spent World War I behind a desk. That last insult struck with surgical precision. Halder had served the Great War in staff positions, yes. Hitler had been a corporal. The class resentment between them, aristocratic Bavarian officer versus working-class Austrian soldier, had simmered for years. Now it boiled over. Yesterday, Halder presented updated numbers. The 6th Army in Stalingrad required 700 tons of supplies daily. If encircled, The Luftwaffe would need to airlift everything: ammunition, fuel, food, medicine, winter clothing. The transport fleet couldn't deliver more than 150 tons per day under optimal conditions. In winter, with Soviet fighters attacking the supply runs, it would be far less. The gap between required and possible was not a matter of opinion, it was physics. Hitler accused him of poisoning morale, of undermining confidence, of lacking the will to victory. Now, standing at attention while Hitler informs him that General Kurt Zeitzler will assume his position, Halder understands that the dismissal isn't really about Stalingrad. It's about a deeper incompatibility. Hitler believes in willpower overcoming material reality. Halder believes in logistics, mathematics, and the lessons of military history. They've been heading toward this moment since 1941, when Halder suggested halting the advance to Moscow to consolidate supply lines. You are relieved of duty, effective immediately. Halder salutes. The gesture is automatic, decades of discipline overriding everything else. He turns to leave. As his hand touches the door handle, Hitler adds, "The Sixth Army will hold Stalingrad. They will not retreat. They will not withdraw. They will hold." Halder does not respond, does not turn around. He walks out of the conference room, through corridors filled with maps showing the Eastern Front's vast distances, past officers who avert their eyes because everyone knows what just happened. In his quarters, he packs his diary. 7 volumes documenting 4 years of war. Evidence of warnings given, protests lodged, alternatives proposed, all ignored. By evening, he'll be on a train back to Germany, assigned to the Führer Reserve, a bureaucratic purgatory for generals deemed unreliable. He'll spend the next few weeks in forced retirement while events in southern Russia unfold exactly as he predicted. The Battle of Stalingrad has been raging for 2 months. German forces control 90% of the city, but Soviet defenders cling to the west bank of the Volga with fanatical determination. Every street requires multiple assaults. Every building becomes a fortress. The Sixth Army bleeds itself dry in brutal house-to-house combat that devours divisions and produces minimal gains. And on the flanks, Soviet armies continue to mass in silence. Halder knows what's coming. The mathematics are undeniable. The timing is perfect. The trap is set. He boards the train, watches Ukrainian countryside slip past the windows, calculates how long the Sixth Army can survive if encircled. 8 weeks. Maybe 10 if they're fortunate. Then starvation. Then surrender or annihilation. 284,000 men. He writes one final diary entry dated September 24th, 1942. The entry is brief, clinical. It notes his dismissal, the reasons given, and his assessment of what will follow. Then he closes the volume and stores it carefully in his luggage. History will need these documents. The train rocks eastward through the night, carrying Halder away from the front he's commanded for 4 years. He doesn't sleep. Instead, he sits in his compartment reviewing maps by lamplight. A habit from decades of staff work, analyzing terrain and logistics with the same precision that made him chief of the general staff in the first place. Few outside the Wehrmacht's inner circle understand how deeply Halder shaped Germany's early victories. The world credits Hitler with the conquests. Military historians know better. Poland, 1939. Halder coordinated the invasion with Walther von Brauchitsch, synchronizing 3 army groups with such efficiency that Warsaw fell in 27 days. The campaign validated everything modern warfare theorists had predicted: rapid mechanized advance, close air support, encirclement of static defenses. The rest of Europe watched in shock as cavalry charges met panzer divisions and collapsed. But Poland was merely rehearsal. France, 1940. When Hitler announced plans for a Western offensive through Belgium, essentially repeating the failed strategy of 1914, Halder and the General Staff recoiled. It would be disastrous, predictable. The Allies would concentrate forces at the Belgian border and create another grinding stalemate like the Great War. Erich von Manstein proposed an alternative: attack through the Ardennes forest, considered impassable for armored formations, punch through the weakest point in Allied defenses, drive to the Channel coast, encircle the British and French armies in Belgium from behind. Hitler, surprisingly, embraced it. Halder refined it into operational reality. The execution required perfect timing: 7 panzer divisions threading through narrow forest roads, emerging simultaneously for the breakthrough at Sedan, then racing 200 miles to the sea before Allied forces could reorganize. It worked with terrifying precision. France surrendered in 6 weeks. British forces evacuated from Dunkirk, abandoning equipment and fleeing across the Channel. Western Europe fell like dominoes. Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, and the Wehrmacht stood triumphant on the Atlantic coast, having achieved what the Kaiser's armies failed to accomplish in 4 years. The world called it the Blitzkrieg. Lightning war. Unstoppable momentum.
Halder knew the truth. Blitzkrieg worked because of meticulous planning, precise logistics, overwhelming concentration of force at decisive points, and, critically, because the campaigns were short. Supply lines stretched dozens of miles, not thousands. Objectives were clear and achievable. The ratio of force to distance remained favorable. Then came Barbarossa. June 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, represented the largest military operation in history. 3 million German soldiers, 600,000 vehicles, 750,000 horses, 3,000 aircraft. 3 army groups attacking simultaneously across a 2,000-mile front from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Halder spent months planning it. The operation required coordinating more combat power than any general staff had ever attempted to control. Army Group North would drive toward Leningrad. Army Group South would capture Ukraine and advance toward the Caucasus oil fields. Army Group Center would smash through Minsk and Smolensk directly toward Moscow. The opening weeks validated every projection. Soviet forces reeled backward, losing entire armies to encirclement. Minsk fell, Smolensk fell, Kiev fell in the largest encirclement in military history, 600,000 Soviet soldiers captured. By October, German spearheads reached Moscow's outskirts. Then winter came. Halder had warned about timing. Barbarossa launched on June 22nd, later than planned because Hitler diverted forces to invade Yugoslavia and Greece in April. That delay cost 6 weeks. 6 weeks that meant German armies reached Moscow in December instead of October, facing the worst winter in half a century wearing summer uniforms. Halder failed to ensure adequate winter equipment distribution. He shared the General Staff's assumption that the Soviet Union would collapse before winter, that Stalin's regime was fragile, that one devastating blow would shatter communist resistance. That assumption proved catastrophically wrong. The Red Army didn't collapse. It traded space for time, retreating eastward, burning everything useful, forcing German supply lines to stretch across increasingly impossible distances. When winter struck, tens of thousands of German soldiers suffered frostbite. Vehicles wouldn't start, weapons jammed, and Soviet forces, equipped for winter combat and reinforced with divisions from Siberia, counterattacked. The advance stalled. Moscow didn't fall. The war that was supposed to end in 6 months entered its second year, with Germany fighting across 1,000-mile supply lines against an enemy that kept producing more divisions, more tanks, more artillery than seemed possible. Halder's relationship with Hitler deteriorated throughout 1942. Every strategic discussion became confrontation. Hitler insisted on simultaneous offensives in multiple directions, toward the Caucasus oil fields and Stalingrad. Halder argued for concentrating force on a single objective. Hitler accused him of lacking vision and aggressive spirit. Halder countered with logistics assessments showing the impossibility of supplying 2 major offensives simultaneously. The arguments grew more heated through summer. By September, they were barely civil. The fundamental problem was that Hitler viewed warfare as contest of wills. If German soldiers fought harder, believed more fervently, refused to acknowledge defeat, they would win. Material shortages, supply difficulties, numerical disadvantages. These were problems to be overcome through determination. Halder viewed warfare as applied mathematics. Armies needed ammunition, fuel, food. Trucks required maintenance. Soldiers needed rest. Casualties accumulated over time. These weren't obstacles to be dismissed through willpower. They were realities that determined what was operationally possible. When Halder presented his assessment of the Stalingrad situation, the massing Soviet forces, the weak Romanian and Italian flanks, the inadequate German reserves, the impossibility of aerial resupply if encirclement occurred, he wasn't being pessimistic. He was reading the map and doing arithmetic. Hitler saw defeatism. Halder saw facts. The train continues through the darkness. Halder finally sets aside his maps, removes his reading glasses, and stares out the window at nothing visible. He spent 4 years as chief of staff, planned campaigns that conquered most of Europe, coordinated the largest military operations in history, built the operational framework for blitzkrieg victories that military academies will study for generations. And now he's being dismissed because he correctly predicted a disaster that's about to unfold. In his compartment, he retrieves volume 7 of his diary, the one ending September 24, 1942. Opens it to the final entry, reads his own handwriting describing Hitler's statement, "The Sixth Army will hold Stalingrad. They will not retreat." Halder knows military history, knows what happens when armies become fixed in place, when reinforcement and resupply become impossible, when numerical superiority shifts to the enemy. He knows what's about to happen at Stalingrad, because it's happened before throughout history, to commanders who mistook stubbornness for strategy. The train rocks onward. Behind him in Ukraine, the final plans for Operation Uranus move toward execution. Soviet commanders finalize assault positions. Tank brigades move into jumping-off points. Artillery coordinates targeting data. And in Stalingrad, the Sixth Army continues fighting house to house, believing that determination will overcome mathematics, that Hitler's will can bend reality. Halder closes his diary and returns it to his luggage. 8 weeks, he thinks again. Maybe less.
November 19th, 1942, 7:20 a.m. Northwestern flank, Don River Bend. The Soviet artillery barrage begins with a sound that soldiers will later describe as the earth splitting open. 3,500 guns,
howitzers, mortars, rocket launchers fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front. The bombardment targets Romanian positions held by the 3rd Romanian Army. Units spread impossibly thin across terrain they lack the numbers to properly defend. Shells fall in patterns calculated to obliterate command posts, communication trenches, artillery positions, and supply depots within the first 15 minutes. Romanian soldiers crouch in frozen dugouts as the world above them disintegrates. The barrage lasts 80 minutes. Some trenches collapse entirely, burying defenders alive. Others simply cease to exist, erased by high explosives that leave craters where defensive positions stood moments before. At 8:50 a.m., the artillery shifts to rolling barrage. Soviet infantry advances behind the curtain of fire, the Southwestern Front and Don Front, totaling 400,000 soldiers. Tank brigades follow, T-34s grinding forward through snow that's already falling steadily, temperature dropping towards zero. Romanian units try to resist. Some positions hold for hours, most collapse within minutes. The defenders lack anti-tank weapons effective against Soviet armor. They lack reserves to plug breakthrough points. They lack the communications infrastructure to coordinate any cohesive response. Individual battalions fight isolated battles while Soviet forces pour through gaps, widening the breakthrough, driving deeper into the rear areas. By noon, Romanian defenses are shattered across 60 miles of front. Field Marshal Frederick Paulus, commanding the 6th Army inside Stalingrad, receives the first reports mid-morning. The initial assessments are fragmentary, confused, understated. A Romanian attack, moderate penetration, situation developing. By afternoon, the truth becomes undeniable. This isn't a raid. It's a full offensive with multiple armies. The Romanian 3rd Army is collapsing. Soviet tanks are already 15 miles behind the original front line, driving southwest. Paulus requests permission to withdraw forces from Stalingrad to block the breakthrough. Hitler's response arrives within hours. No withdrawal. The 6th Army will hold its position. Reserves will contain the Soviet advance. What reserves? Paulus studies his maps with growing dread. The 6th Army is committed entirely to street fighting in Stalingrad. There are no reserve divisions. The nearest German units are scattered across hundreds of miles, already engaged in their own sectors, lacking fuel and ammunition for rapid movement. November 20th. The southern pincer strikes. Soviet forces south of Stalingrad, the Stalingrad Front, launched their assault against Romanian positions held by the 4th Romanian Army. The pattern repeats: massive artillery preparation, overwhelming infantry assault, armored exploitation. The southern Romanian defenses fracture as catastrophically as the northern ones did 24 hours earlier. Now 2 Soviet pincers drive toward each other. Northwestern forces push southwest, southeastern forces push northwest. Between them, in Stalingrad and immediately west of the city, sits the entire 6th Army. 290,000 German soldiers and support personnel fully committed to urban combat, unable to disengage, unaware that they're about to become the largest encircled force in military history. German units outside the developing pocket attempt desperate counterattacks. A panzer division manages to slow the northern advance temporarily. An infantry division establishes a defensive line that holds for 36 hours before being bypassed. These actions buy time, but cannot stop the inevitable geometry of encirclement. November 23rd, 4 p.m. Kalach on the Don River. Soviet tank brigades from the northwestern and southeastern pincers meet at the village of Kalach, 45 miles west of Stalingrad. The moment the lead tanks make contact, the encirclement becomes complete. Every German soldier in Stalingrad, the entire 6th Army, plus portions of the 4th Panzer Army, is now trapped inside a pocket roughly 30 miles wide and 25 miles deep. No ground supply route exists. The Don River blocks movement west. Soviet forces surround the entire perimeter. 284,000 men. Paulus immediately radios Army Group B headquarters requesting permission for a breakout. The Sixth Army must withdraw westward immediately, fighting through Soviet lines before the encirclement solidifies. Every hour of delay allows Soviet forces to strengthen the ring, dig in defensive positions, bring up reinforcements. The response from Hitler arrives via Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. The Sixth Army will hold its position. The Luftwaffe will supply the army by air. Relief forces are being organized. Paulus reads the message twice. Hold position. Aerial resupply. Relief forces. Paulus summons his logistics officers, spreads maps across the table, asks a simple question. What do we need daily to sustain current operations? The calculations take an hour. The answer is precise. 700 tons per day minimum. Ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, replacement equipment, winter clothing. 700 tons delivered every single day without interruption. Someone asks the obvious question. Can the Luftwaffe deliver 700 tons daily? Every officer in the room knows the answer before anyone speaks. The Luftwaffe's entire transport fleet, every U-52, every HE-111 converted for cargo, operating at maximum capacity under perfect conditions, might deliver 300 tons daily. Maybe. That assumes no losses to Soviet fighters, no weather delays, no mechanical failures, no shortage of aviation fuel at the departure airfields. And conditions are far from perfect. Winter is arriving. Blizzards will ground flights for days at a time. Soviet forces are advancing southwest from the encirclement, pushing German airfields farther away, increasing flight time, reducing payload capacity, exposing transport aircraft to longer periods under fighter attack. One of Paulus's staff officers does the arithmetic aloud. If the Luftwaffe manages 200 tons daily, an optimistic projection, the Sixth Army faces a 400-ton daily deficit. That deficit accumulates. After 1 week, 2,800 tons short. After 1 month, 12,000 tons short. Ammunition will run out first, then fuel, then food. How long can we survive? Paulus asks. The answers vary. 6 weeks if rationing begins immediately. 8 weeks if the Luftwaffe exceeds projected delivery rates. 10 weeks if relief forces break through quickly. No one mentions what happens after those timelines expire. Paulus drafts another message requesting permission to break out. Hitler's response comes faster this time, more emphatic. The Sixth Army occupies a fortress. Fortresses do not surrender. Hold position, await relief.
Outside, snow falls steadily. Temperature drops to -15 Celsius. German soldiers in Stalingrad, equipped for summer fighting, wrap themselves in whatever fabric they can scavenge. Many still wear lightweight uniforms designed for August combat, not November cold. The Luftwaffe begins resupply operations November 24th. The first flights deliver 70 tons total. Not 70 tons per aircraft, 70 tons combined from every transport that reaches the pocket. Soviet fighters intercept several planes. Anti-aircraft fire downs 3 more. Weather forces multiple missions to abort before reaching Stalingrad. 70 tons, against a requirement of 700. Paulus reduces rations immediately. Ammunition expenditure is restricted to defensive operations only. Offensive actions inside Stalingrad cease. The Sixth Army transitions from assault to siege defense, conserving resources, waiting for relief that Hitler promises is coming. November ends. December begins. Daily aerial deliveries average 100 tons. Some days reach 150. Other days, blizzards ground the entire transport fleet and nothing arrives. Soldiers survive on quarter rations. Horses are slaughtered for meat. Fuel reserves dwindle toward empty. The pocket shrinks gradually as Soviet forces compress the perimeter. German units abandon outlying positions to shorten defensive lines, consolidating into tighter spaces where artillery fire becomes more effective against concentrations of troops. Inside the pocket, soldiers begin dying from causes other than combat. Frostbite amputations increase daily. Malnutrition weakens immune systems. Dysentery spreads through units sharing contaminated water sources. Medical supplies run critically low. Morphine, antibiotics, bandages, surgical equipment. Franz Halder, in his forced retirement in Germany, follows the news from Stalingrad with grim validation. Everything he predicted is unfolding exactly as his calculations projected. The Romanians collapsed. The encirclement succeeded. Aerial resupply is proving inadequate. The Sixth Army is dying slowly, trapped in a pocket Hitler refuses to abandon. 8 weeks from the encirclement date, mid-January 1943, will mark the point where organized resistance becomes impossible. Halder knows this. Every general staff officer with basic understanding of logistics knows this. Apparently only Hitler doesn't know this, or refuses to acknowledge what the numbers prove beyond question. The relief forces Hitler promised begin organizing in December. Operation Winter Storm, a counteroffensive designed to break through Soviet lines and open a supply corridor to Stalingrad. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein assembles whatever units can be scraped together from other sectors. Depleted panzer divisions, exhausted infantry, units already below combat effectiveness from months of continuous operations. The relief attack launches December 12th, makes initial progress, advances to within 35 miles of the pocket, then stalls. Soviet reinforcements block further progress. German forces lack the strength to sustain the offensive. By December 23rd, the relief attempt collapses. Manstein's forces withdraw to defensive positions, unable to reach Stalingrad, unable to break the siege. Inside the pocket, soldiers listen to radio broadcasts promising relief, describing counteroffensives that will save them, insisting that the situation remains under control. They stop believing the broadcasts. They can see their situation deteriorating daily. They can count rations shrinking. They can watch comrades dying from cold and hunger and wounds that would be survivable with proper medical care. The fortress Hitler ordered them to hold is becoming their tomb. And in Germany, Franz Halder sits in his study, reviewing his diary entries from September, reading his own predictions written 8 weeks ago with the clarity of mathematics and military history. 284,000 men. He was right. Being right provides no satisfaction whatsoever.
January 8th, 1943. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, Soviet forces launch Operation Ring, the final destruction of the trapped German army. The objective is simple: compress the pocket systematically, eliminate resistance sector by sector, force surrender or annihilation. The Sixth Army no longer resembles a functional military force. It resembles a collection of starving, freezing men clinging to ruins because orders from 1,500 miles away demand it. Daily rations have dropped to 3 ounces of bread per soldier. Horses are gone, consumed weeks ago. Some units resort to eating rats. Others boil leather boots for whatever nutrition can be extracted. Ammunition shortages force impossible choices. Artillery pieces sit silent, their crews ordered to conserve shells for only the most critical threats. Infantry fight with rifles but limited bullets. Machine gun positions ration bursts to 3-round intervals. When Soviet attacks come, German defenders must choose which threats to engage and which to ignore, because they lack ammunition to address everything. Medical facilities overflow with casualties who cannot be treated. Morphine ran out in December. Bandages are reused until they disintegrate. Surgeons perform amputations without anesthesia. The wounded lie in unheated cellars,
packed together for warmth, dying slowly from infections that antibiotics could prevent if antibiotics existed. Frostbite cases exceed combat casualties by wide margins. Soldiers lose fingers, toes, feet, hands to cold injuries. Many cannot hold weapons anymore. They huddle in whatever shelter exists, waiting for death from cold or Soviet bullets or starvation, whichever arrives first. The Luftwaffe continues resupply flights, but delivers increasingly inadequate tonnage. January weather grounds transports for days at a stretch. When flights do reach Stalingrad, Soviet fighters exact mounting tolls. Transport crews call the missions death runs. Many refuse to fly. Some crews are executed for cowardice. Others fly the missions and never return. January 10th. Soviet forces split the pocket in two. German units in the northern section become separated from those in the south. Coordination between sectors becomes impossible. Each fragment fights independently, increasingly desperate, increasingly hopeless. Paulus requests permission to surrender. Hitler's response, fight to the last man. The Sixth Army's sacrifice inspires the German people. Its resistance ties down Soviet forces that might otherwise attack elsewhere. Surrender is forbidden. January 22nd. Soviet forces capture the last functional airfield inside the pocket. Aerial resupply ceases entirely. The remaining U-52 transports attempt parachute drops from high altitude, but most supplies fall into Soviet-controlled areas. German soldiers watch parachutes drift beyond their reach, carrying food they'll never eat. The southern pocket commander radios that his sector can no longer resist. Fuel is exhausted. Ammunition is exhausted. His soldiers are eating the dead. He requests permission to cease fighting. Permission denied. January 30th. Hitler promotes Paulus to field marshal. The promotion arrives via radio, along with a pointed message. No German field marshal has ever surrendered. The implication is clear. Paulus should commit suicide rather than capitulate. Paulus reads the promotion order, understands its meaning, chooses to ignore it. The next day, January 31st, Soviet forces overrun Paulus's headquarters in the basement of the Univermag department store. He surrenders personally to Soviet officers, becoming the first German field marshal captured alive in the war. The northern pocket continues resisting 2 more days, not because soldiers believe relief will come or that resistance serves any purpose. They fight because they're too weak to march to Soviet lines for surrender, because some officers still threaten execution for anyone who quits, because after months of horror, the distinction between fighting and dying has become meaningless. February 2nd, 1943. The last German units in the northern pockets surrender. The Battle of Stalingrad ends. Soviet forces count the prisoners. 91,000 German soldiers. Many can barely walk. Most weigh less than 90 pounds. Thousands died during the first days of captivity, their bodies too damaged by starvation and frostbite to survive even with food and shelter. Of those 91,000 prisoners, fewer than 6,000 will ever see Germany again. The rest die in Soviet camps over the following months and years, from disease, malnutrition, forced labor, execution. The casualty accounting takes weeks to compile. The Sixth Army entered the pocket with 290,000 personnel. Approximately 10,000 were evacuated by air before the pocket closed completely, mostly wounded and essential specialists. That left 280,000 trapped. 91,000 surrendered. The difference? 189,000 died during the siege, killed in combat, frozen, starved, dead from wounds, dead from disease, dead from conditions that transformed a modern, mechanized army into a medieval horror. 284,000 casualties total when accounting for those who died in the initial encirclement and breakout attempts. The number Franz Halder predicted in September. News of Stalingrad's fall reaches Germany gradually. The Nazi propaganda machine attempts to frame the disaster as heroic sacrifice, as noble resistance against overwhelming odds. Radio broadcasts describe the Sixth Army's martyrdom, their courage, their refusal to yield despite impossible circumstances. German citizens see through the rhetoric. They understand what Stalingrad means. The Wehrmacht, previously invincible, unstoppable, triumphant across Europe, has suffered catastrophic defeat, an entire army destroyed. Germany's strategic initiative on the Eastern Front shattered. The myth of inevitable victory exposed as lie. In his study, Franz Halder receives confirmation of Stalingrad's fall. He doesn't feel vindicated, doesn't feel satisfaction at being proven correct. He feels sick. He opens his diary, Volume 7, the one ending September 24, 1942, the day of his dismissal. Reads his final entry, predicting encirclement, predicting inadequate aerial resupply, predicting disaster. 8 weeks, he'd calculated. The pocket lasted 11 weeks total, but organized resistance collapsed almost exactly on his timeline. The mathematics were accurate. The logistics assessments were accurate. Everything he warned Hitler about came true with horrifying precision. 284,000 men died because one man refused to acknowledge arithmetic. Halder closes the diary, stores it carefully. The war will continue 2 more years, but Germany has already lost. Stalingrad proved that Soviet industrial capacity, manpower reserves, and strategic depth exceed Germany's ability to overcome them. The Eastern Front will grind westward inexorably now, consuming German armies in battles of attrition that numbers and resources determine more than courage or skill. Hitler fired his chief of staff for predicting disaster. 8 weeks later, the disaster unfolded exactly as predicted, and the army that might have escaped, that might have preserved its strength for future operations, that might have survived to fight another day, that army died in frozen ruins because retreat was forbidden. Franz Halder would survive the war, survive imprisonment after the July 1944 assassination attempt implicated him in anti-Hitler conspiracies, survive liberation by American forces in May 1945. He would spend years after the war working with U.S. Army historians, providing his diaries as primary source documentation, helping reconstruct the decision-making processes that led to Germany's defeat. But he would never forget Stalingrad. Never forget standing in that conference room in September 1942, presenting facts and calculations to a man who valued willpower over reality, who believed determination could overcome logistics, who sent 284,000 soldiers to die rather than admit mistake. The full accounting takes months to compile. But when military historians finish reconstructing the Stalingrad disaster, the numbers tell a story of willful blindness that cost an army its existence. Daily supply requirement, 700 tons. Daily supply delivered, 117 tons average across the siege. Total deficit accumulated over 11 weeks, 44,000 tons. That gap between what was needed and what arrived represents the mathematical expression of death by starvation, death by cold, death by inadequate ammunition, death by preventable disease. The Luftwaffe flew 6,591 sorties attempting resupply missions, lost 488 aircraft, Ju-52 transports, He-111 bombers converted for cargo, FW-200 Condors, even a few experimental designs pressed into service out of desperation. More than 1,000 Luftwaffe personnel died in the airlift. They delivered 8,350 tons total across the entire siege. 8,000 tons against a requirement of 54,000. The aerial resupply operation that Hitler insisted would sustain the Sixth Army delivered 15% of minimum needs. 15%. The other 85% simply arrived arrived, and men died from its absence with arithmetic certainty. Soviet forces captured detailed German records, quartermaster logs documenting daily rations, medical reports tracking frostbite casualties, ammunition inventories showing progressive depletion, communication transcripts revealing desperate requests for supplies that never came. The documentation paints a picture of an army dying in quantifiable increments, so many tons short, so many calories below survival threshold, so many degrees below freezing without adequate clothing. Franz Halder's September assessment predicted exactly this outcome, not because he possessed special insight or superior intelligence, because he understood basic military logistics. An encircled army requires aerial resupply equal to consumption. The Luftwaffe lacked capacity to deliver required tonnage. Therefore, encirclement meant destruction. The conclusion followed inevitably from the premises. Hitler rejected the assessment because he rejected the premises. He believed the Luftwaffe would find a way, believed German soldiers would endure through superior will, believed the situation could be overcome through determination rather than tonnage delivered. Reality proved otherwise. Reality always proves otherwise when mathematical requirements meet insufficient resources. The strategic consequences rippled outward from Stalingrad's ruins like shockwaves from an explosion. Germany lost not just the Sixth Army, but also 2 Romanian armies, 1 Italian army, and 1 Hungarian army, Allied forces that dissolved during the encirclement, their survivors retreating in chaos or surrendering to Soviet advance. The entire southern sector of the Eastern Front collapsed. Soviet forces advanced hundreds of miles westward, liberating territories Germany had conquered in 1911 and 1942. More critically, Germany lost strategic initiative. After Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht never again mounted a successful major offensive in the east. Every subsequent operation became defensive, reactive, attempting to contain Soviet advances rather than achieving German objectives. The war transformed from conquest to survival, from expansion to delaying inevitable defeat.
The psychological impact exceeded even the material losses. German soldiers who believed themselves part of an invincible military machine now understood they were mortal, their leadership fallible, their nation capable of catastrophic failure. That knowledge spread through the ranks like poison, corroding confidence, undermining the certainty that had characterized German operations since Poland. For Soviet forces, Stalingrad provided validation. They could defeat the Wehrmacht in sustained combat. They could execute complex operational maneuvers. The double envelopment that trapped the Sixth Army demonstrated sophistication equal to German planning. They possessed the industrial capacity to replace losses and the manpower to sustain offensive operations. Stalingrad transformed the Red Army from desperate defenders into confident attackers. Western allies recognized the significance immediately. Churchill called it the turning point. Roosevelt sent congratulations to Stalin. Both understood that the Soviet Union would survive, would fight on, would eventually push German forces back toward Berlin. The strategic calculus for the entire war shifted based on one battle's outcome. And that outcome was predictable. Franz Halder predicted it in September. Other general staff officers predicted it. Anyone capable of reading supply reports and performing division predicted it. The disaster wasn't inevitable. It was avoidable. The Sixth Army could have withdrawn before encirclement, could have broken out immediately after Soviet forces closed the ring, could have been saved. Hitler chose otherwise.
In the years following the war, historians debate whether Hitler's decision constituted military incompetence or deliberate sacrifice. Some argue he genuinely believed the Sixth Army could be sustained and relieved. Others suggest he recognized the army was doomed, but calculated that its prolonged resistance served strategic purposes, tying down Soviet forces, buying time for other sectors, demonstrating German resolve. The historical evidence suggests a simpler explanation. Hitler could not admit mistake. Retreating from Stalingrad meant acknowledging the summer offensive failed. The strategic situation had deteriorated. His judgment was flawed. Those admissions were psychologically impossible for him. So he insisted the Sixth Army hold position, insisted aerial resupply would work, insisted relief forces would arrive, insisted on all these things because the alternative, accepting responsibility for catastrophic miscalculation, violated his self-conception. 284,000 men paid the price for that psychological inability. Franz Halder lived until 1972, dying at age 87. He spent post-war years working with American military historians, publishing his diaries, providing testimony about German decision-making processes. He remained careful in his criticisms, diplomatic in his assessments, professional in his analysis. But when asked about Stalingrad, the careful diplomacy disappeared. He would describe presenting his September assessment to Hitler. Describe the shouting, the threats, the dismissal. Describe being proven correct 11 weeks later when everything he predicted materialized with mathematical precision. Describe watching an army die because one man refused to acknowledge reality. It was preventable, he told interviewers decades later, his voice still carrying traces of anger. Every aspect was preventable. The encirclement was predictable. The supply crisis was predictable. The ultimate collapse was predictable. We told him. He didn't listen, and 200,000 men died as a result. History remembers Stalingrad as the turning point of World War II's Eastern Front. Military academies study it as the definitive example of urban warfare's costs. Memorials commemorate the soldiers who fought and died in the city's ruins. But the deeper lesson, the one Franz Halder understood in September 1942 and spent the rest of his life trying to articulate, concerns the relationship between leadership and reality. Armies require supplies. Encircled forces need resupply equal to consumption. These aren't matters of opinion or morale or willpower. They're mathematical facts. Leaders who ignore mathematical facts create disasters regardless of courage, determination, or force of personality. Hitler fired his best general for stating those facts. 8 weeks later, one of history's greatest military catastrophes unfolded exactly as that general predicted, because reality conforms to mathematics, not wishes. 284,000 men learned that lesson too late to benefit from it. Their deaths remain testimony to what happens when ideology confronts arithmetic, and leaders choose ideology. The ruins of Stalingrad stand as monument to that choice.